Imagine waking up one morning in 1660 and discovering that half your hair has fallen out overnight. Your scalp is covered in oozing sores, and tiny creatures are literally crawling across your pillow. Now imagine that instead of seeking medical help, you decide the best solution is to cover it all up with an elaborate hairpiece made from the hair of dead people and horsetails. Welcome to the real reason behind powdered wigs, the most successful cover-up in fashion history, where looking fabulous meant hiding the fact that your body was rotting from the inside out. What I'm about to reveal will completely shatter everything you think you know about those pristine white curls adorning the heads of historical figures. Because those elegant wigs weren't a symbol of wealth and sophistication, they were desperate attempts to hide the devastating effects of disease, poor hygiene, and a medical understanding so primitive it would make a medieval barber surgeon look like a genius. Before we dive into this historical nightmare that makes modern beauty standards look absolutely reasonable, make sure you hit that subscribe button because we're about to uncover the grotesque truths that would make even the most hardened emergency room doctor reach for a bath bag. The powdered wig epidemic began in the courts of Louis XIV, but not for the reasons your history textbook told you. The Sun King didn't start wearing wigs because he thought they looked regal. He started wearing them because syphilis had turned his scalp into a landscape of horror that would make a zombie apocalypse seem like a spa vacation. By the time Louis was 30, the great pox had eaten away so much of his hairline that he looked like he'd been struck by lightning and lived to tell the tale. But Louis wasn't alone in his follicular nightmare. Syphilis was rampaging through European aristocracy like a medieval plague, leaving a trail of bald, scarred, and disfigured nobles in its wake. The disease, which had arrived from the New World like the worst possible souvenir, was particularly fond of destroying hair follicles and creating open sores that would make even the most experienced plague doctor question their career choices. The Marquise de Maintenon, one of Louis XIV's mistresses, documented in her private letters the horror of watching the disease progress through the court. She described noblemen whose hair fell out in clumps during dinner parties, leaving behind scalps that looked like they'd been attacked by a particularly vindictive cheese grater. The smell, she noted, was so overwhelming that servants would faint while helping their masters dress for court functions. Now here's where the story gets truly revolting. The medical understanding of syphilis in the 17th century was so spectacularly wrong that doctors actually believed the disease could be cured by covering the affected areas and preventing air from reaching the sores. This brilliant medical logic led to the practice of wrapping syphilitic scalps in bandages soaked in mercury. Yes, the same mercury that was slowly poisoning the patient from the outside while the syphilis destroyed them from within. The wig became the perfect solution to this medical disaster. Not only did it hide the horrific appearance of diseased scalps, but it also provided a convenient way to conceal the bandages and mercury treatments that were supposedly healing the condition. The elaborate height and volume of these wigs weren't artistic choices. They were engineering solutions designed to accommodate the bulky medical dressings underneath. But syphilis wasn't the only culprit in this follicular apocalypse. Lice infestations were so common among the European aristocracy that having a head full of these blood-sucking parasites was considered as normal as having fingernails. The wealthy didn't see lice as a hygiene problem. They saw them as an inevitable part of life, like taxes or death. The solution wasn't to get rid of the lice, it was to build a bigger, more elaborate house for them to live in. The construction of these lice palaces was a process that would make even the most dedicated insect enthusiast weep with horror. Wig makers would start with a foundation of horsehair, known for its durability and its ability to maintain the complex architectural structures that these hairpieces required. Then they would add layers of human hair, often purchased from peasants who were desperate enough to sell the hair off their own heads for a few coins. The human hair trade was a booming industry built on desperation and disease. Hair merchants would travel through impoverished villages, buying hair from women and children who needed money more than they needed their natural covering. The hair was rarely cleaned before being incorporated into wigs, which meant that every wig was essentially a collection of other people's scalp problems, parasites and diseases, all woven together into one magnificent monument to poor decision-making. The Duke of Orleans, brother to Louis XIV, kept detailed records of his wig maintenance routine, and reading these documents is like taking a masterclass in historical horror. His personal wig keeper, A man whose job description would make a modern occupational safety inspector have a nervous breakdown would spend hours each week extracting dead lice, lice eggs, and what the Duke delicately referred to as scalp matter from the elaborate structures. The powder that gave these wigs their distinctive white appearance wasn't just a fashion choice, it was a pesticide delivery system. The powder was made from flour, rice starch, and various toxic substances designed to kill the lice and other insects that called these hairpieces home. Lead powder was particularly popular because it was effective at killing parasites, though it had the unfortunate side effect of also slowly killing the person wearing the wig. The application of this powder was a daily ritual that resembled chemical warfare more than a beauty routine. Servants would use bellows and specialized brushes to coat every inch of the wig with the toxic mixture, creating clouds of poisonous dust that would fill entire rooms. Many wig servants developed what we now recognize as lead poisoning, suffering from tremors, confusion, and eventual death from their daily exposure to these chemicals. But here's where the story takes an even more disturbing turn. The baldness that necessitated these wigs wasn't just caused by syphilis and lice. The fashion for extremely high foreheads in women led to a practice called plucking, where women would literally pull out their hairlines to create the desired aesthetic. This voluntary self-mutilation often resulted in permanent scarring and hair loss, creating yet another market for elaborate wigs and hairpieces. Lady Frances Howard, Countess of Somerset, was so dedicated to this practice that she plucked her hairline back nearly 4 inches, creating a forehead so vast that contemporary observers compared it to a field prepared for battle. The constant trauma to her scalp led to chronic infections that required daily treatments with mercury and arsenic-based ointments, turning her morning beauty routine into something that resembled medieval torture. The merchants who sold these wigs weren't just businessmen. They were enablers of a massive public health disaster. Wig shops were essentially disease distribution centers, where parasites and infections were passed from customer to customer through shared combs, brushes, and styling tools. The practice of renting wigs for special occasions meant that a single hairpiece could host the scalp problems of dozens of different people throughout its lifetime. The social pressure to maintain these diseased fashion statements was so intense that people would literally rather die than be seen without their wigs. The Countess of Blessington wrote in her diary about attending a ball where a gentleman's wig caught fire from a candle, and instead of removing the burning hairpiece, he continued dancing while his head smoldered because removing the wig would have revealed his syphilis-ravaged scalp to the other guests. The servants who maintained these wigs developed an entire professional hierarchy based on their willingness to deal with increasingly disgusting conditions. The lowest-paid wig servants, often called lice pickers, would spend their days extracting parasites and cleaning bodily fluids from the hairpieces. The highest-paid wigmasters were those brave enough to work on the wigs of syphilis patients, where the risk of infection was so high that many wore leather gloves and face coverings that made them look like medieval plague doctors. The economic impact of this wig obsession was staggering. The French court alone employed over 3,000 people in wig-related industries, from hair collectors to powder manufacturers to the specialized carpenters who built the elaborate stands needed to store these towering monstrosities. The wig industry consumed so much flour for powder production that bread shortages in Paris were partly attributed to the aristocracy's need to maintain their elaborate hairstyles. The medical community of the time was completely baffled by the health problems associated with wigs, primarily because their understanding of disease transmission was roughly equivalent to believing that illnesses were caused by bad smells and moral failings. Doctors would prescribe increasingly elaborate treatments for wig-related health problems, including bloodletting, mercury baths, and the consumption of exotic animal parts, all while completely ignoring the obvious solution of simply removing the disease-infested hairpieces. The decline of the powdered wig wasn't driven by a sudden outbreak of common sense or improved medical understanding. Instead, it was economic and political upheaval that finally convinced people to abandon this fashion nightmare. The French Revolution made elaborate wigs a symbol of aristocratic excess and a potential death sentence for anyone foolish enough to wear one in public. Revolutionary mobs would literally hunt down people wearing powdered wigs, seeing them as walking advertisements for the old regime. The American colonies had their own complicated relationship with powdered wigs. importing both the fashion and the diseases that came with it. George Washington, contrary to popular belief, didn't wear a wig. He powdered his own hair, which was actually a slightly less disgusting practice, since it eliminated the risk of inheriting other people's scalp problems. However, many of his contemporaries weren't so wise, and colonial newspapers regularly featured advertisements for wig cleaning services and lice removal treatments. The final death blow to the powdered wig came from an unexpected source: taxation. The British government, desperate for revenue, imposed a tax on hair powder that made the daily maintenance of elaborate wigs prohibitively expensive for all but the wealthiest citizens. This powder tax, combined with changing fashion trends and a growing understanding of hygiene, finally convinced people to abandon their parasite-infested hairpieces in favor of more natural styles. But even as the fashion died out, the health consequences lingered for decades. Former wig wearers suffered from chronic scalp conditions, lead poisoning, and mercury-related neurological problems that would plague them for the rest of their lives. Many of the behavioral oddities and mental health issues documented in 18th century aristocrats can be directly attributed to decades of poisoning themselves with toxic wig powder and mercury treatments. Now, I need to provide some historical perspective here, because not every wig wearer was dealing with advanced syphilis or chronic lice infestations. Many people wore wigs simply because it was fashionable, and some wig makers did make efforts to maintain basic hygiene standards. However, the fundamental problems of disease transmission, toxic chemicals and parasitic infestations were inherent to the wig-wearing culture of the time, affecting everyone who participated in this fashion trend to some degree. The archaeological evidence from 18th century burial sites tells the final chapter of this story. Excavations have revealed that many of the elaborate wigs buried with their owners had literally fossilized around the skulls, held in place by decades of accumulated powder, bodily fluids, and decomposed organic matter. Some of these burial wigs still contained the preserved remains of lice and other parasites, creating a horrifying time capsule of historical poor hygiene. So there you have it, the absolutely revolting truth behind powdered wigs finally revealed. These weren't symbols of elegance and refinement. They were desperate attempts to hide the devastating effects of disease, poor hygiene, and medical ignorance. The next time you see a portrait of a distinguished 18th century figure with their pristine white curls, remember that underneath that dignified exterior was likely a scalp ravaged by syphilis, crawling with lice, and slowly being poisoned by toxic chemicals. The powdered wig represents one of history's most successful attempts to literally cover up a public health crisis with fashion. It's a testament to the power of social pressure and the lengths people will go to maintain appearances, even when those appearances require them to slowly poison themselves and host entire ecosystems of parasites on their heads. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to appreciate the fact that the worst thing I have to worry about in my hair is the occasional bad hair day. And if you enjoyed learning about this historical nightmare, make sure you're subscribed to our channel, because we've got plenty more disgusting secrets from the past that will make you grateful for modern medicine, basic hygiene, and the simple luxury of being able to wash your hair whenever you want, without risking social exile or death from toxic chemicals.